Welcome back. This is the 18th segment in our series, Because It's True, making the case for Christianity in bite-sized pieces. We are working from an apologetic model, which when diagrammed is rather skeletal, with three prongs to it. The first being philosophical, and then historical, and then experiential. We have begun putting some flesh on this skeleton by addressing the first prong, philosophical. That is, asking the question, what might we reasonably expect an individual to reasonably conclude if that individual thinks about all that is observable to us in the natural world. Now, the first slab of meat we put on this prong of philosophy is the teleological argument, or the argument from design. The second slab of meat that we're going to put on this prong is the moral argument. But to do that, we need to start with this observation, and that is that there are four options concerning God's existence. The first is God does not exist. Atheism. The second is God exists. He is distinct from his creation, but he is thoroughly uninvolved and non-communicative with it. That would be deism. The third is that the universe is God. God is the universe. Everything is God. Pantheism. Then the fourth is the notion that is affirmed by the Jewish faith, Christianity, and Islam. And that is that God exists, he is distinct from his creation, but he is involved with his creation and communicates with his creation, especially in terms of what is right and wrong. Now, if anyone affirms the first three of these positions, atheism, deism, or pantheism, then the inevitable conclusion that they have to come to is that morality is relative, subjective, subject to an individual's preference. Now, there are those who say, okay, morality is relative. Well, in that case, what they have to do is decide which of these first three categories they fall into. But then I would also encourage them to live consistently with their convictions and the implication of their convictions, and that is live consistently with the notion that morality is relative. Everybody decides for themselves what is right and wrong, because there is no ultimate right and wrong. There is no transcendent standard that applies to all of us, because there is no God. Therefore, we're the best we've got. Now, the problem comes when you challenge someone to live consistently. Because even if someone wants to promote the idea that there is no absolute right and wrong, they will not live that way. Here's the deal. Everyone has a notion of what is expected with decent behavior. You make a promise, you keep it. You aren't You aren't rude to people. You have respect for others. However, if an individual, no matter what they profess to believe about the existence of God and morality, is suddenly accused of breaking the standard of decent behavior, which is assumed applies to everyone, they will immediately begin to make excuses as to why it was acceptable for them to do what they did. They will begin to bring in another standard which supersedes the standard that they are being accused of breaking in order to justify what they have done. You see, this notion of decent behavior presses in upon us so consistently that when we are accused of doing something wrong, we try to justify it and say it was not wrong. And yet, there is no such thing as right or wrong. Now, the same thing applies if they feel like they have been wrong. Somebody breaks into their house, steals all their stuff. They say, you should not, you ought not to have done that. And yet, if you're going to be consistent that there is no right or wrong, there is no absolute standard of morality, actually the best that you can say is it ruined your day. Now, some might say, well, no, there is no absolute standard, but what there is a herd instinct. We try to take care of each other. Okay, but here's the problem. Let's say you're walking down a trail next to a river and you see a man drowning in the river, and there are two instincts. One instinct says that you ought to jump in the river and save him. The other instinct says you ought to keep yourself safe. But there is a third instinct that says what you really ought to do is number one, that the right thing to do is to try to save that individual. A standard which cannot be one of those first two instincts. Or you might say, well, no, morality is something that has evolved with us socially so as to maintain society in a cohesive form. Well, that just begs the question. Because the question is, why should I care about society? Who says I ought to be concerned about society? You? Well, that's your morality, but it's not my morality. And who are you to say that my morality is wrong? You see, we cannot escape the fact that there is a moral law to which we all subscribe. It may differ and vary in basic ways, but it's there. And if there is a moral law, there is a moral lawgiver. Now, what I have shared is a paraphrase of a case that C.S. Lewis made in his book, Mere Christianity. He has more to say, and we'll get to that in the next segment.